Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's Big Issues in Biodiversity Science webinar hosted by WABSI, the West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute. My name is Owen Nevin and I'm the CEO of WABSI. And in opening our meeting today, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that we are meeting on, particularly here where I sit in Perth, the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of this land, paying our respects to elders past, present and emerging wherever it is that we meet. For some of our international guests, they may not be familiar with this practice in Australia that we pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land that we are privileged to be able to live and work on. And for those of us in the environmental arena and conservation, biodiversity science, it is a very important part of our thinking and our engagement with this land and this place to acknowledge the 60,000 years or more of traditional practice and management, the knowledge that comes with that. So in opening this seminar today, I just will take a couple of minutes to introduce WABSI and who we are, and to promote some upcoming events. This is part of a quarterly series of webinars with the next webinar scheduled for October 21st, where we will be looking at the costs of invasives, particularly weeds, and their threats to biodiversity globally, looking at the InvaCost program and the findings from that. We'll also launch our West Australian Weeds Research Priorities Plan at that event. And a reminder for those who are in West Australia, and Perth in particular, the Biodiversity Conference focusing on resilient landscapes is coming up next month for those of us who are fortunate enough to be here in the state. WABSI is a joint venture of 10 organisations, 4 universities, 4 government departments, a museum, and our Commonwealth Research Organisation, CSIRO, and we exist to facilitate partnerships and collaboration to deliver outcomes, better outcomes for biodiversity in the state of Western Australia. We do that by bringing together the end users who generate the questions around these complex and difficult problems in biodiversity that require more than one actor to solve. So while it's an often overused term, we really do spend our time looking at those wicked problems, the ones where changing one thing leads to a multitude of other outcomes. And we work with end users, researchers, policymakers, and our partners across the sphere in an iterative process to identify what are the key knowledge gaps that would filling those gaps would lead to better outcomes for biodiversity, stronger decision making, and better outcomes in the long term for both a sustainable environment and a sustainable economy for the state. In doing that, we take on a range of topics, and one which is to be highlighted today is that digital transformation in environmental assessment. And we are fortunate to have with us today our speakers from Aalborg University in Denmark and Centre for Environmental Assessment, Ivar Lien and Emilia Ravenbos. Ivar and Emilia have agreed to spend some time with us today and talk about their work looking at international frontrunners in digital environmental assessment and the use of digital data. And Emilia is fighting through a COVID infection while presenting to us, so we really thank her for making herself available today, and please do excuse her if she needs to take a moment for a drink or to catch her breath. as she presents to us. So without too much further from me, I would like to hand over to our speakers, and I believe Ivar is going to lead off.
Thank you, Owen, and thank you for inviting us to this webinar series. We're very happy to present some of our findings and work from a Danish context. And we're very happy to present to Western Australia, because we see a lot of things going on down there, and we are also inspired by what you do. So hopefully we'll give some good discussions afterwards, after our presentation. I will start out with a short introduction, then Emilia will do a presentation of a report we made with the title Frontrunners within digitalisation of environmental assessment. And then I will conclude with some slides and sharing about the DREAMS project that we are currently engaged with in Denmark. And if you have any questions, you're most welcome to put them into the chat, and then I think Owen will use them or take them afterwards, after the presentation. But just to give you a short introduction to who we are, Emilia and I, then we are part of the Danish Center for Environmental Assessment, which is a research group at University in Aalborg, consisting of 25 people working with different aspects of impact assessment, with different backgrounds, and a very nice mixed group. And we are primarily doing research within this intersection of something around decision making, something around impact assessment tools, and something around stakeholder involvement. And for the impact assessment tools, that relates to the environmental assessment that we're going to talk about today, related to plans and programs and projects and policies. But it also includes life cycle assessments, input-output assessment, and so on. So the digitalisation projects we do is in part the DREAMS project that we will explain more in detail later. But it's also more broad use of data and open data for different aspects of sustainability assessment within life cycle assessment, etc. And it's also related to new possibilities within digitalization and assessments of the sustainability implications of new technologies. So not to confuse too much, then what we are discussing today is, at least in a European sense, related to directives on environmental assessment of plans and programs, in which the key idea is that we need to include environmental information and concerns into decision making within a range of parameters that includes biodiversity, and therefore interesting for this session as well, but also a lot of other environmental parameters. So this is the background on the point of departure. Now Emilia will take over explaining what we found in a study made on who is really internationally front runners on digitalization within this area.
Yes,
and Emilia, you just let me take over if corona illness is.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eva. So as Eva said, I want to tell you a little bit about this report that we wrote, which you can see we have linked to here on the right-hand side, called Digitalisation in Environmental Assessment. And the investigation essentially started back in October 2020, in conjunction with the kickoff of our project, the DREAMS project, which we will get into later in this presentation. But we essentially wanted to get an overview of what initiatives to digitalize environmental assessment we are currently taking place internationally. So we knew that in Denmark the initiatives were limited, but we wanted to find out how this looks on kind of a global plan. And so we set out to find what we in this summary report consider our international frontrunners. And we essentially had 4 kind of motivations for writing this report. First off, we wanted to establish a state of the art, which could kind of act as our point of departure for any future initiatives. But most importantly, we wanted to be able to learn from the international experiences. Of course, recognizing that there's a growing kind of interest in digitalization and a tremendous amount of accumulated knowledge from the different experimentations that are already taking place in case studies around the globe that can give us valuable takeaways and help to inform also any future initiatives. And this also kind of ties in with our third purpose of wanting to create a hub for exchanging these experiences and creating this digitalization community or network between the initiatives. So our network, our digitalization network, it started a couple of months ago, and we now look forward to our second meeting here at the end of August. And then lastly, we also wanted to be able to understand our own DREAMS project within kind of the current context of other digitalization projects. And next slide. So that was our primary motivation for the report and conducting interviews. And lucky for us, we were also able to find many engaged organizations and different frontrunners and initiatives. And with this slide, I actually just wanted to show you the faces behind these initiatives. So we have 15 representatives in all, spanning a total of about 9 different organizations. So this was just to kind of give you an idea of the people behind the projects and the experiences that I'll go on to present to you in just a moment. Next slide. I'll make this slide very brief. It was just to give you access to or present to you some of the different publications that might be relevant for digitalization within environmental assessment, that if these slides are made accessible after the webinar, you might be able to access. Next slide. So after conducting our interviews, we made this figure which maps the different organizations and their corresponding initiatives against the different phases of environmental assessment. I won't necessarily go into too much detail, but it was primarily just to show that there's a lot of variation in where the initiatives apply within the EA process, and thereby also very different ideas of what function the digital tools should have within EA. So in other words, there's a wide spectrum of what precisely digitalization in EA actually means for the different organizations and what it is intended to do. Next slide. It's essentially this broad spectrum of application that will set the frame for the way that I present the different digital initiatives today. So instead of running through them kind of one by one or country by country, I've decided to kind of group the initiatives based on the way in which they apply digital tools. So focusing a little bit more on the similarities between the function that the tools they might have. So there are these 5 different functions. So the first is the digital means for collecting EA reports in repositories. Then there's also a focus on the data aspect, on curating and archiving data for EA support. So for instance, generating better, more informed environmental baselines, etc. Then there's tools for digital reporting. There's a digital focus on automating some of the processes throughout EA based on earlier environmental assessments. And lastly, there's digital means for decision support, which also includes the use of SDGs in those decision-making processes. So I'll spend the next, I think, about 15-20 minutes or so on presenting some of these initiatives. And I'll be rather brief in my description, but of course, I can always read more about the initiatives in the report, which we've linked to earlier in this presentation. Next slide.
Emilia, if you just need a moment for having your breath, then I could supplement that we of course, it's a difficult task to make a report on international frontrunners, because there might always be somebody who is doing something that we don't know of. So if you, as audience, know very interesting initiatives, we are very eager to hear about them. And for methodological transparency, we based the report on quite severe Googling of initiatives, and all interviewees were asked about awareness of other relevant initiatives. Yes.
Yeah, so the first function is generating digital EA report repositories. So this essentially means centralizing the collection and the upload of EA reports. So one of the major challenges that were expressed through our interviews is that EA reports, they are usually scattered across different online platforms, and some belong to municipalities, some belong to consultancies, etc. And so as a result, there were some efforts to try to make a central database for storing these reports in a common repository. And this, of course, makes the reports themselves more easily accessible, but it also provides a better access to the old data that's captured in these past environmental assessments, which of course in turn then increases the transparency for communities that are directly impacted by these decisions. Next slide. So for our first initiative, we turn to Scotland, where the Scottish government, they have created this repository called the SEA Gateway and Database. Here, the EA reports, they're essentially submitted to the gateway, and they are then distributed to relevant consultancy authorities who provide hearing comments. And these comments are then they're then processed, and the reports are then uploaded onto the SEA database, where they are publicly available. And I should mention, it's both the reports that are publicly available as well as all of the hearing comments from the consultancy authorities. It's mandatory for screening and scoping reports, but voluntary for the pre-screening and the environmental reports. But they still managed to get about a 99% response rate there. So meaning that there's, it's also being used on a voluntary basis as well. The picture here is of the database, and you can see that you can, for instance, search based on project sector, on the type of plan and program, on the stage of planning, legislation, responsible authority, etc. And you essentially get a list of the different reports that apply to your search criteria. And when clicking on those reports, it opens up for some metadata, as well as links to the reports themselves and the hearing comments. It's funded by the Scottish government and then maintained by kind of an internal IT team. We also heard from that they have only created this report repository for SEAs, as they've concluded that the number of EIAs is too great and would require too many resources to be able to collect and sort in the same way that they can for SEAs. So it does require a lot of resources to manage such a repository. Next slide. Oh. Okay, so this is if you click on, if you search through the criteria, then you get this list of reports, and I think if you click one more time. Yes, so then this is just to show you the metadata and the reports links at the bottom. And I just wanted to share with you this quote from William Carlin, who has had a central role in the Scottish government in generating this gateway. So he says, it's a platform for interaction and learning, as well as a platform for the information to be available for the community who is likely to be affected, and for responsible authorities. it is an extra element of transparency. And so here it was just to show that there's a focus on how this centralized access to EA reports is important in regards to transparency and involving the community that is directly impacted by the decisions that are being made, and relevant project and plan development. And next slide. If we then take a look at our takeaways from the international frontrunners, then regarding the report repositories, they experience a benefit in increasing access to old data that might be otherwise forgotten in old reports, and also experience an autonomy in the availability of data and the old and future EA reports. So this essentially means that those stakeholders directly impacted by the decisions within the EA, they, such as the local community, they get a whole other form of access to environmental assessments for projects and plans conducted in their local area. Next slide. So there are also digital initiatives for curating and archiving data for EA support. And this is essentially where organizations, companies, and authorities, they are encouraged to publish their data from environmental assessments. So here, thereby then providing open access to the data, which is used to then, for instance, inform future EA baselines. Next slide. If we turn to Denmark, we have the Danish Environmental Portal. It's a data platform that provides GIS-linked spatial data for use in environmental assessments. It's also possible to download spatial polygons of project areas and see what data directly impacts that particular project area. And this data is directly available, and also I can note that it is being widely used today by a lot of EA practitioners to inform their environmental baselines. Next slide. Also in Denmark, we have GBIF, or the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is an international network and data infrastructure funded by many of the world's governments. They collect data on biodiversity. This data is also used for many other purposes than for environmental assessment, but there's been a growing attention on how these data platforms, they can benefit EA and strengthen the data that feeds into these EA baselines. And there's also a focus on the fact that there's so much data collected during the EA process that goes lost. And so they put a lot of attention on producing guidelines for EA practitioners to encourage them to submit data that they've collected through environmental assessments to these open databases. And so these are the links that you see here on the screen. So there's one from 2011 and then a more updated best practices guide from 2021. Next slide. A current ongoing initiative in England is creating these online evidence hubs for the purpose of developing statements of common ground, as they're called, for different sector types to be able to base environmental assessments on. So it builds upon stakeholder and expert agreements on sector-based scoping and mitigation measures on the basis of previously conducted environmental assessments and monitoring reports and government reports, etc. The idea is then this will also be supported by live monitoring, and the need for these statements of common ground is essentially based on the findings from a pilot project for offshore wind farms that found that the data collected for offshore wind industries is plentiful, but the data is still very underutilized when it then comes to other environmental assessments on or other projects on creating offshore wind farms, etc. Next slide.
I could supplement on the industry evidence program, the pilot project on offshore wind, that the people involved found that the plentiful of the many pages and the many investigations of different environmental parameters were very often leading to assessments of being non-significant. And one of the ideas for the industry to take part in this is that they felt like it was a repeating process, that every time they wrote a lot of pages about something that they in advance somewhat knew that wouldn't be significant, and therefore they saw a possibility to make a better scope by using the experience from the last 30 years or whatever, focusing their reports to what is the significant impacts. Maybe that was your takeaway, Emilia. Sorry for that.
Oh no, that is okay. I don't think I'm repeating what you said here, so that's fine. So essentially, what is it that we can then learn from using digital means for curating and archiving data for EA support? We found that it gives an opportunity for reusing a lot of the data and recovering otherwise lost data. Also, a significant amount of the data in environmental assessment is underutilized, and which also leads to a lot of neglected valuable knowledge for informing future environmental assessments. But at the same time, this also requires a cultural shift regarding the ownership of data and the collaboration for the so-called collective benefit. So are organizations willing to share their data in order or with other organizations, or are they more prone for the privatization of that data? Next slide. So if we move on to digital EA reporting, then we find digitalization being used also as a way to rethink the way that environmental assessment reports they are presented. And instead of kind of presenting the information in 100+ page reports, then information is displayed through animations or through visuals and interactive platforms and videos. And this makes for more digestible EA reports. And as I'll come to talk about with some of the initiatives, they've also been used to as a way to increase public participation in EA processes. Next slide. So in the Netherlands, they have used something called iReports, in which they've taken the more traditional EA and made into an online digital platform. So here the information is presented visually and rather than through text. And this essentially opens up or allows for a sort of storytelling of project development. And stakeholders are kind of guided through or involved, directly involved in the decisions being made throughout the environmental assessment. This is an initiative stemming from a consultancy company by the name of Royal Haskoning, DHV. It's currently sold as an additional service to the traditional EA, seeing as there's still a legislative requirement for submitting PDF reports of environmental assessments. Next slide. And here I just also wanted to share with you this quote by Paul Eisen from Royal Haskoning DHV. It says, "We have to go through a digital transformation also as a company. People are used to writing documents, and that means I have to try to get them away from text and start the process of visualizing. And so this was just to emphasize the kind of the transition that EA practitioners are also required to go through when employing these digital tools, and how it's a new way of thinking environmental assessment. Next slide. So also in Netherlands, in the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, they use these digital environmental platforms to increase the citizen involvement and engagement. So they've begun linking within the digital, the iReports, they've begun linking to a digital hearing platform where citizens then have the opportunities to submit hearing comments and essentially remain actively involved in the project as it progresses. Next slide, thank you. So essentially digital reporting, it creates a larger degree of transparency. It makes EA reports more accessible and digestible for the public and other stakeholders. In Holland, they at least expect this to increase the inclusion of citizens in the EA process. But as we also heard from Paul Eisen, that it requires this new digital transformation for practitioners. So they need to think in terms of visually displaying information and need to move away from this report way of thinking. Next slide. And we also have digital tools focused on automating EA processes. So in order to streamline the EA procedure where possible. So this is essentially aimed at replacing the more administrative tasks of impact identification and also the act of actually writing the reports, which then will leave more time, hopefully, for increasing the quality of the EA reports and for proper decision making, etc. Next slide. So an initiative or an example of this is if we go to Western Australia, we have a project called by the name of eBase. A primary output of eBase is auto-generating text that has been previously submitted to the system in conjunction with conducting prior EIAs. So within the eBase platform, then activities from a particular project are linked with relevant impacts and potential mitigation measures. Stakeholders can then kind of select or deselect impacts given a corresponding project activity, and then afterwards select some controls for mitigating these impacts. The auto-generated text based on the selected impacts and controls is then kind of created again based on what has been previously submitted to the system. And the text can, of course, be presented in different formats and can be contextualized for the individual project. Some of this auto-generated text, it ranges from anywhere between 50 to upwards of 400 pages. Yes, next slide. And so according to kind of our interviews with representatives from eBase, they've been able to see that automatizing these processes decreases overall time spent on the administrative and preparatory work, and also diminishes the need to have to rewrite large chunks of repeating text for each environmental assessment. And this then also gives them more time for optimizing the content of EA and the decision-making and considerations that go into project plan development. But then at the same time, we also have to look towards one of the earlier takeaways concerning the cultural shifts, because the original vision for eBase was to get all EA practitioners, so everyone conducting EAs, to share this common data platform and be able to use data from other projects. But due to kind of a resistance in sharing data across projects and organizations, this meant that they had to change their original vision in eBase and have now digressed from this idea of collaboration between consultants to a platform for data management for the individual project and client. And next slide. And our last function we have here is decision support and the SDGs. And essentially here we have using digital tools to enhance the ability to support decisions throughout across kind of the entire environmental assessment process, and then as well as using these sustainable development goals as a way to make these decisions as well. Next slide. So I wanted to very briefly mention some of these WABSI initiatives here, namely the SAFE framework, which is the shared analytic framework for the environment, which is the framework that you see here on the left-hand side of the slide, which is used for decision support in environmental assessment. But I also feel that Owen would be much better at presenting them. So I think that I will kind of leave it at this. And see, I also have a point here about environments online, which is as Owen has described it in our interview with him, as a digital one-stop shop for storing reports, and also an online dashboard for accessing project data. So a form of project site for stakeholders to access data about the environmental assessment in the project that they are working on. But again, I don't feel that I would be the most qualified to talk too much about these initiatives, but I felt it was important just to mention them here. And then I'd like to go on to the next slide. And here we come to the DREAMS project, which stands for Digitally Supported Environmental Assessment for the SDGs. It consists of an environmental baseline tool and an effect-based tool for decision support, and also has this focus on integrating the SDGs. But here I will give the word back to Eva, who will tell you a little bit more about this project. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Emilia, and well done despite Corona. It was not that impacting your voice so far. Now, the DREAMS project, then we changed from presenting something that we have heard others do to presenting something that we are currently doing. And the DREAMS project is started October last year and will run for 3 years. And the point of departure in a Danish context was that the general perception and practice is that we do a lot of EA reports. They are produced manually, and they are hidden in some shelf or in a drive in a computer, and it's not always possible to find it. And if it's possible to find it, then it's not really used by others than those who produce it. So there's, at least before we started, there was little accessibility, there was little reuse. We do use digital technologies in the sense that authorities are allowed by legislation to do consultation online, and we're also allowed to do digital EA reports if they are have a fixed version. And as Emilia said, we have a practice in which we use the Denmark's environmental portal for getting an overview of what is known about environmental aspects in a certain area. And then we have a situation, or had a situation, where each consultancy company, or to some extent each of the larger local authorities, had their own digitalization activities or projects going on. Most of them related to communication, equally to the Dutch experience that Emilia talked about. So it was a fragmented picture in Denmark in terms of getting access and in terms of developing new solutions. And we therefore framed the DREAMS project based on these problems: lack of easy access to data, quite extensive reports due to broad scoping, because there were either little learning from past reports in terms of what is significant, or very divergent experiences about what is significant, and no common platform to have this discussion upon. Then we had a highly manual, we still have a highly manual and time-consuming EA process with some opportunity within the digital development, and a situation where SDGs were not either operational or not included in practice. And somewhat optimistic as we are, we set out to solve all these problems, and doing that by making reports and background data accessible in the middle of the slide, and synthesizing, or aiming at synthesizing, experiences from all the past reports to a platform that can be accessible for everyone, and by integrating SDGs in that process. And we made some somewhat bold assessment of expected effects. Some of them relate to a better use of mitigation measures on greenhouse gas emissions more directly into the EA reports, and we estimate that to 15 to 50%, primarily because we are not that good at it right now in Danish environmental assessment practice to show ways to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. We expect more focused reports due to better use of past experience, resulting in cost reductions, and at least our commercial partners in the project sees quite huge potentials for making new market adventure on these digitalization opportunities. So, facts about the project: it's 27 million Danish kroner. I'm not sure about how much it is in Australian dollars, but in euro it's around 4 in that league. And for a researcher like me, I would say that's a lot of money. We can do a lot. And for the computer science or the software developers included in the consortium, say you can't get anywhere for 27 million Danish kroner. So we are also, it's also a learning process across partners. We are funded by the Innovation Fund Denmark, which is a public funding for any type of projects, but with a huge focus on sustainability and green transition. And then the partners, you can see that to the right, they are a mix of university key competences on computer science and environmental assessment and sustainability. And we on the top we have the key major infrastructure developers, public-owned infrastructure developers in Denmark for the rail and for the road and for the energy infrastructure and for the metro. And then furthering on to the right, we have the huge consultants, some of the huge consultancy companies in Denmark, Rambo and Covey. And then we have the ministries involved in the project, in part to keep the dialogue about regulatory changes needed in order to make these coming solutions work. And then, of course, we have the Danish Environmental Portal as a key partner on existing solutions. And it's for fun, since this is the DREAMS project, we call it the Dream Team. And it somewhat still continues to be that, because it seems that it is a very strong consortium taking or being represented the key actors to make these solutions. Of course, we need a broader involvement of a lot of other consultancies and municipalities, authorities, but we have a very good starting point for that. The value generation, I briefly mentioned it before on the related to the green transition and developing new business opportunities and something around cost reductions. But it's also value generation in terms of more democratic processes. We expect that since we do make solutions that are open access or accessible for everyone, for the public, the public might also be better equipped, more qualified due to this access to engage in decision-making processes. And hopefully we can also get more qualified discussions across actors in the environmental assessment process. So getting more into the tools, this is a snapshot of current interface within the Denmark's environmental portal that is openly accessible for everyone, and you can click into different layers and see status for a lot of parameters that it relates to nature, archaeology, to some extent groundwater, protection areas, etc., etc. And our first idea here was to broaden the scope. They have a lot of environmental parameters, but the scope within environmental assessment, or the concept of environment within environmental assessment, is broader than we currently have, so we wanted to expand that. It's not very innovative, but it's an important process in terms of increasing quality and environmental assessment. But that ambition, initial ambition, has been complemented with ideas for integrating past reports, past EA reports into this platform. We currently have identified 1,800 environmental assessments of plans and programs in Denmark from the past 20-30 years. And we are now in a process of figuring out how are these environmental reports smartest shown in a GIS map like this one. And we are currently considering ways to make search options in which you can, for instance, search for biogas plants, environmental assessment of biogas plants that are located within areas of groundwater protection interest, or windmills that are located within shore landscape interest close to the shore, etc., etc., so that we get an informed, a GIS-informed search for relevant environmental assessment reports. So that's one tool, or an extended idea for one tool. Here we also discussing ways to make it possible for actors to upload background reports, field surveys, etc., that is somewhat equal to some of the other international experiences that Emilia presented. And this, you can say, to some extent, it's a tool that says something about the status of environment, and to some extent also around baseline development for a given context, broadening up to new environmental parameters, is then hopefully going to play together with the other tool that we are developing in the DREAMS project. And we call that the Causa tool, which is emphasizing its focus on causal effects. So the idea is here that we will synthesize experiences about significant impacts and mitigation measures, etc., from the 800 past reports into an interface or database, and then visualized in this interface, again with open access for all who wants to have access, It will be in Danish, but besides from that, or at least for a start. And the idea is then, or you can say this visualization is the preliminary idea of what the user will need or meet. You will start from the left side, putting into the system that you are about to do, for instance, a wind farm or a biogas plant or a railway or a road or a project, etc. And you will then be led through the past experiences in a synthesized way. The first box will tell you that based on the last 5 or 10 years of EA reports within this sector, the wind farms, we will have an overview saying something about the relevance, which again is something related to the frequency of cases in which population was deemed to be significant or biodiversity were deemed to be significant, and here probably biodiversity would be higher in relating to wind farm. But the idea is that you as a user will get support to make your scoping document or your scoping process, and the idea that you will get a common platform for doing that, so that you as a developer or consultant or authority have a starting point for the discussion for the specific project. And here, of course, important that we will not, with this tool, give solutions or final, the most precise solution for that. We will inform and we will suggest something. And of course, for every case or every project, you need to consider it in relation to the context and the setup or the project characteristic. But it's a start. So for a start, you get an overview of potential significant impacts. Then if you press one of them, here is the human health, you will get to the next box, in which you will get some information about what are then the typical impacts and what are their cause, because it might be from different aspects of the project, different phases, etc. What are the definition, etc. So there are some characteristics for each, you can say, sub-impacts within human health in this case. And we also imagine that you will get an SDG indicator related to that, so that it will be easier for you to assess the performance of your project against SDGs. And then going even further from that, and to some of the most interesting, is you can say an overview of impact mitigation measures used in the past, related to each of these health impacts, and with information hopefully around the effects of these and possibly side effects or synergies with other aspects of the project design, for instance. And it looks very good on paper, and we still believe in the idea. However, it's a long process of figuring out the best way of extracting all these information from the EA reports. We are currently in the process, you can say, a parallel process of finding ways to extract it manually for a start, and then parallel to that, a process of exploring automatic machine learning based extraction methods. And for the latter, for the machine learning, we are, or our computer science partners, although they are quite brilliant, they are very much challenged by the varying nature, the unstructured data that we have in the EA reports, in the sense that the data, the information in the reports are structured differently. It's written in different languages depending on who made it. The information about significance and mitigation measures are not always straightforward to extract, because either they are formulated in a weird way or they are not necessarily in the same sentence or in the same page. So we are facing quite a lot of challenges related to that, and that is in part why we are having these two parallel processes, in the sense that we hope that the manual annotation of hopefully many reports will provide a way to assist and inform the machine learning process. Yeah, I can tell a lot about that because that is what we are into right now. And as Emilia said previously, of course, there are some issues around data sharing, cultural and business-wise, that we are currently building our tool on what is possible to be found publicly and among authorities and among the partners, which is seems to be quite a huge percentage. But we also have some Danish actors that we are continuously negotiating with or trying to persuade in terms of sharing background data, etc. Yes, our idea with the two tools is then that they are used in a series of phases within the environmental process. One part of these information are relevant for the preparatory work in designing or adjusting the project. Some of them are relevant on the screening and scoping phase. And of course, the identification of existing conditions are primarily used using the baseline tool that I showed before. And the effect-based tool, the CASA tool, is primarily used in the prediction and assessment of effects and the development of mitigation measures. And then we are currently working on different ways to make this learning curve. Our current idea is that we are likely to have regulation in place that forces everyone to upload all the reports to this database, and we are considering different ways to help the machine learning part of it, extracting the relevant information to continuously inform and update the two tools. Yes. So our current status is that we are getting there on the reports. We've been web crawling and approached actors for half a year now. And we are at this point on almost 1900 reports. We have the dialogue with the ministries on how to institutionalize new solutions. We have an ongoing process of making ends meet or making a common language between the computer science partners and the environmental assessment actors, both in terms of what is possible, what's doable, what is relevant, how should functionalities be within these tools, what does it require, not only from a computer science perspective, but also from an environmental assessment practitioner perspective in terms of updating, in terms of structuring, etc., in the operation phase afterwards. Emilia has been a key actor in terms of developing an SDG framework, or at least an outset of a framework, and we are currently testing it in specific projects and plans. And as I said before, we are using a lot of time in the manual annotation of reports these months. So that's a somewhat quick run through of the environmental or the DREAMS project as it is right now. I think we will leave the word to Owen if and maybe
Excellent.
there are questions.
Yes, there's some questions coming through, and I'll remind everybody that there's the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you type in a question there, then we'll be able to see it, and I'll endeavour to integrate questions together so that we can answer and address as many points as possible. And Before moving to questions, thank you both for some very informative presentations, and I think it's been a very useful piece of information to share so far. And we have a few questions already, so I'll maybe go to Amelia around the frontrunners aspect. We've got a question around what makes a frontrunner, and what conditions, or have you seen in that work, conditions that need to be in place for those frontrunners to emerge?
Yeah, so I would say right now a frontrunner is defined by kind of an organization that's willing to experiment with these new digital tools in some way. It's not something that that we have seen widely practiced across the globe right now. Of course, we recognize we might not have found all initiatives occurring out there, but it is there starting, or it's something that's starting to emerge and popularize. With regards to kind of preconditions, is that what the question called? So a concept for me that kind of was continuously emerging during the interviews that I had was this idea of a culture shift. And it was both a culture shift with regards to, in terms of kind of collaboration and this willingness to share data. And it, of course, it depends a little bit on what the digitalization or the digital tools are meant to kind of perform. But if they're used to optimize the data that feeds into environmental assessment, then I do think that organizations and consultancies, they really need to rethink the way that they approach their ownership of data. And that was something that we heard, or I heard across many different interviews that also hit very many different functions of the digital tools and many different initiatives as well. And then there's also the culture shift in needing to, again, rethink the way that we do environmental assessment. And so maybe it's not the most optimal to write a 400-page report, and that's only accessible via on a municipality website hidden in some tab somewhere. And so I would say, as far as preconditions go, it's definitely a cultural shift that kind of, to me, is one of the first things that would need to be tackled.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I was about to say that in terms of frontrunners, we see a lot of organizations doing something on the visual part, or making it online, or making it more better communication of the content. And then who is the front runner within that sphere? And it's somewhat subjective. We don't have a lot of detailed criteria for choosing which one to go for, but we try to find those who have developed it the furthest within their part. And in terms of preconditions, now policy drivers are mentioned, and we didn't hear that, or at least I didn't hear that in the interviews. We hear legislation as something that can be a barrier, but not policy drivers as a necessary driver to digitalization efforts. I think some of the types of digitalization initiatives are attractive enough for partners. Of course, there is the aspect of sharing, but besides from that, at least to my understanding, consultancy and developers see huge benefits in digitalization. We see some champions, as mentioned in the question. Paul Eisen in the Netherlands has been a champion on some of the efforts for 20 years. So of course it's also depending on somebody who's really using a lot of energy on it. And technology is mentioned, but But when we speak to computer science people, they say, well, technology is there, it's a matter of using it, or to the extreme, combining different solutions. So for that, it is there, it's just a matter of getting into the right context.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Another sort of theme of questions that are coming through are around the data structure and automation opportunities that you just alluded to there. The computer science and data science tools that are there just need to be drawn across. And in your presentation, you talked about the challenge that exists because of the diversity of structures in the way that data is presented in reports. And sort of pulling all those themes from the questions together, could you expand a little on what you see as some of the opportunities that, I suppose, opportunities for improvement, and then opportunities in that automation space that you're deeply embedded in now?
Yeah, I think we need to distinguish automation in different purposes, in the sense that in the DREAMS project, we are primarily using automation to extract and synthesize data from existing reports. And in other international initiatives like the eBase, it's also automation in terms of generating text for reports. I think they are different in nature in terms of the automation. And what we are dealing with right now is that it's like making ends meet, that in some ways it seems like a huge task to make the automation of extraction of data of how the data is currently structured in the EA reports. They sometimes when they are frustrated, they say this must be the most terrible machine learning exercise in the world, because it is so different and so little structure that we have in the reports when it comes to text, at least, and how we write the reports. And we are currently reading through all these several hundreds of reports and trying to show to the computer which part of this sentence defines the significance, which part of it, which words defines the subactivity of the project, and so kind of predicate that links them, and so on. And even for those of us who have been working with environmental assessment for many years, we find a lot of instances where it's not straightforward, or at least is ambiguous, what is actually meant here, or how should we understood it. And if it's ambiguous to me as an environmental assessment practitioner, then it's terribly impossible to learn a computer to do automatic extraction of such data. So making ends meet, we are discussing different ways to help the computer doing the extraction or the automatic extractions by considering to introducing national-wide different tables or very structured overviews in the non-technical summary of the information needed, not only to inform machine learning, but also to make it clearer to the reader. Because I think that's a side effect, and when we are forced to go so deeply into digesting the content formulations in the report, it becomes clear to us that there are some room for improvements also in the communication part.
Yeah. Yes, an interesting aspect of trying to train the computer and then realizing how ambiguous our use of language and presentation can be, even among experts. A couple of other questions that have come through are really touching on any lessons that you've learned or things you've picked up that might be useful to share around the challenges of cross-jurisdictional integration of data sets, or the IP ownership challenge and confidential data as you're building up the layers, or as you're looking at those international case studies. So the integration of data with different ownership sets and different levels of confidentiality and data security.
Would you go first, Emilia, or should I?
I was just gonna say, I don't know if you can talk a little bit about kind of the process through the DREAMS project, which you might be better informed about than myself.
Sure. Denmark is a smaller country than Western Australia, so I guess we have another point of departure for these processes. We, to a large extent, have this, you can say, nationwide data format requirements, or at least agreements, so that data is structured the same way, at least the field data, noise modeling, etc., are made in the same way across actors in Denmark. So we don't have the big issues of making sure it's the same format that we enter the data into. We do have some interesting discussions about ownership and confidentiality. Right now, it's I think the majority is of the opinion that if it is part of something that is delivered to a public authority, that could be an environmental assessment of a plan or program, and has been part of the public hearing, then it is in principle public data, at least in a Danish setting, and therefore it can be part of the solutions we're going to make. But of course, there are forces that tries to keep a business model in which data confidentiality is key, so that they are the one that knows about these data. Nobody else is allowed to get them. Yeah, sorry, Owen, did you have other aspects of that question?
I suppose maybe to pass it over to Emilia and ask in the international review that you did in the interviews, were there any lessons or insights that you can share that came through, because this integration of data under different ownerships is a ubiquitous issue. It's something that occurs everywhere.
Yeah, of course, I'm kind of I guess the scribe for a lot of a lot of these initiatives, and I'm definitely not an expert on the precise kind of start or discussions for each of these initiatives. But I do know that it again, as Eva said, I think it does also come down to kind of the culture of the context that you're working in. I know, for instance, we had a discussion with or an interview with someone sitting in England who is continuously saying that it also, like, this whole form of collaboration on data that we are trying to get to work through our DREAMS project is something that wouldn't necessarily translate very well into the kind of the context of the United Kingdom, etc. And so I do think, yeah, I think there's a lot of very context specific nuances that go into that.
Okay, and maybe two final questions that I'll throw out at once, because you may want to sort of combine them in answering them. Do you have any plans to incorporate numerical modeling or data processing into the sort of the latter stages of DREAMS? And at what level would you like to see DREAMS reach to become a really significant impact on the EA process in Denmark?
I think it is. Yeah, it's we have a lot of ambitions, and I think it might be that DREAMS can get to a point where we also include digital modeling tools, etc. But right now we are focusing on making this common platform to support the scoping and screening and mitigation identification in the process, and it is far out in the future to get to the point where we also include modeling tools and so on in the DREAMS project. We hope that the DREAMS project will boost the digital transformation in Denmark, and we believe that we set some key starting points or milestones, achievements during the way, but it's a first step in a long process that includes a lot of potentials for not only synthesizing past reports, but also using some of the technologies and the purposes that Emilia talked about in International Frontrunners in terms of being a platform for EA processes across actors, or being a platform for digital modeling, etc. We're not sure how far we will go. It of course depends on how eager the partners are and funding opportunities, but I think it will look widely different 10 years from now. And of course, each partners are doing digital modeling tools, digital cloud versions, etc. in their own organization. The question is, when does it make sense, and when are we ready culturally to make some joint platforms for that?
Very good. Well, thank you both very much for your presentations and for the discussion, and thank you to our participants online for their questions. In closing, I'll throw up a screen share of a slide to remind people of the next WABSI Big Issues in Biodiversity Science webinar, which will be on October 21st, addressing weeds threats to biodiversity, and a reminder for those of our participants here in Western Australia of the Biodiversity Conference here in Perth, 15th of September. Thank you again, everyone, and we will make the recording of this webinar available online, and you will receive a feedback questionnaire in your email inbox. It's very helpful to us to get responses to those surveys. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.